And now to bring our discussion of news and propaganda and diplomacy together, we have another chance, a different perspective to bring this all together. And this is from Nick Schifrin. Nick is the Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent for PBS NewsHour, so many of you will have seen him regularly. He leads the NewsHour's foreign reporting. He has created week-long in-depth series for news hours from China, Russia, Ukraine, more than I can recount here. His series Inside Putin's Russia won a 2018 Peabody Award. And generally, he has really made himself known as the master of very thoughtful, incisive, and in-depth coverage of a lot of foreign issues. So it's a great pleasure for me to pass to Nick Schifrin.
Sebastian Newman, thank you so much. David, Glenn, and Carol, it was a pleasure to listen to that panel. Just such interesting insight. And thank you overall to the American Academy of Diplomacy, the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies, and of course, the larger University of Virginia Center for Politics. A journalist who became a policymaker once criticized me and my fellow journalists as peddling in anecdotes. Personally, I'm a journalist, so I actually think anecdotes are memorable and illustrative of larger points. So forgive me for beginning by peddling two anecdotes before zooming out and talking a little bit more strategically about the topic at hand. On March 3rd, 2014, I was in Novo-Ozernoye in Crimea, and I was outside a Ukrainian base on what was still then officially Ukrainian land, but the newly arrived soldiers did not raise the Ukrainian flag, and the welcoming committee did not pledge allegiance to Ukraine. This was a point at which months of protests in Kyiv, as all of you will remember, led to a revolution in which a pro-Russian Ukrainian government fled Kyiv, replaced with a technocratic government, ostensibly pro-Western. And it, of course, led to the invasion by Russian soldiers of Crimea and its subsequent annexation. So in Novo-Ozernoye that day, my team and I approached this base and wanted to speak to the Crimeans outside. The Russian troops a few hours before had occupied the base without firing a shot. And we realized that the Crimeans were bringing them sandwiches and tea. "We are here to support the Russian peacekeepers," one man told me. "They are the only means to stop the violence." "We think they protect us," a local woman told me. "Protect you from whom?" I asked. "Fascists in Kyiv," she said. "You mean the protesters 350 miles south? Have you seen any evidence that they're coming to you?" "No, but I've heard rumors," she said. "The Russians will protect us." Much, of course, has been made of Crimea's linguistic and cultural connections with Russia, with Crimeans' disappointment with a government in Kyiv that literally did not speak their language, but also wasn't listening to them. Years of requests of development aid and economic assistance had been discounted. But those opinions in Crimea, which were genuine, were largely a product of disinformation. And in this case, facilitated and produced by state-owned Russian television. By then, the Russian government had cut off Ukrainian TV in Crimea and replaced it with what Peter Pomerantsev, who's an excellent author on Russian disinformation, labeled the fire hose of falsehood. The demonstrators in Kyiv are Nazis, are fascists. So we, the Russians who won World War II, have to resist. Those fascists will come to destabilize Crimea, much like the West destabilized the Soviet Union or Russia after the Soviet Union fell, leading to breadlines and poverty. And that is what the message that Russian TV delivered to Crimeans. This is not news to inform, obviously, it is news to persuade. and it comes all the time, and it helped Russia annex Crimea. Second anecdote, a few months later, I will tell a shortened version of this one because I told a version of it last year to the American Academy. I was in Jerusalem after a punishing 6-week war in Gaza between Hamas and the Israeli military. And I was getting my watch fixed in Jerusalem. And the woman asked me who I was, and I explained that I had been a reporter in Gaza for the last 6 weeks, and I just left. And she said, "Did you tell the truth?" I was like, well, okay, I think I always tell the truth. It's like, no, you reporters don't. Did you tell the truth that Gazan women throw their babies in front of our missiles? That's what she thought, genuinely, that mothers in Gaza sacrificed their children in order to achieve a PR campaign led by Hamas. This is not true, obviously, and was a product of propaganda on Israeli television. So this is not only about our adversaries. This exists in many ways and has existed for many years. We cite a Mark Twain line often, that a lie travels around the globe while the truth is putting on its shoes. Turns out I did a little research. Mark Twain never said that. But anyway, the better quote, perhaps, is Jonathan Swift. And I think this is a good overarching point for what we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so. If a lie is believed only for an hour, it has done its work. Falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. So that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late. The tale has already had its effect. The impact of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, which of course are all distinct, but the impact of all three cannot be overstated. It has existed as long as communication has, and as we're going to talk about later, and as you guys have been talking about, it truly does present an existential threat to a liberal democracy functioning. Of course, more recently, we have been focused on decades of Soviet active measures and then Russian active measures. We are focused today on Chinese disinformation efforts, propaganda efforts that have increased during COVID. And of course, we are looking at January 6th and why that happened and what people are still saying about it and how that leaves America. Now, news, the Reporters Without Borders says, is a vaccine to disinformation. I would love to believe that. And on its face, it's true. We heard Maria Ressa, who just won the Pulitzer Prize for peace, even though she's a journalist, talk about that idea that the only way to have a relationship between the government and the governed is to agree on a set of facts. And that's simply all she was trying to do in a country where the president, Rodrigo Duterte, did not want her to be able to deliver those facts. But the news is getting weaker, as you guys have been talking about. And disinformation is getting stronger. And there is nothing stopping that trend. And that trajectory, I would argue, of the media, of information, is mirrored in diplomacy, is mirrored in US influence. The US is relatively becoming less influential. Authoritarian regimes are growing stronger. And so that's what I want to talk about today. The media, diplomacy, the US ability to deliver diplomatic outcomes are symbiotic. They will fall, they will rise together, and the threat truly is existential. So let's talk about the news media getting weaker first. We can go through this pretty quickly. It's well known, but some of these stats are pretty extraordinary. A lot of my fellow journalists blame more competition. At the very least, this has meant less influence for the carefully curated news that we have come to believe in the last 120 years, the objective news chosen by editors who are either trained or experienced to do so. There is less funding in the news. We used to rely on classified ads, help wanted ads, stocks listings, subscriptions. I mean, it seems so quaint and silly right now, even general advertising, all of that has dried up. And what that has meant is that there are simply fewer journalists doing the work. From 2008 to 2019, the number of people employed by newsrooms in the United States dropped by 23%. So 1 out of every 4 journalists lost their job between 2008 and 2019. And while I couldn't find any studies that actually objectively measured this, it is, of course, unimpeachable to argue that that has reduced the scope of journalism across the country. Of course, we saw a lot of that in 2016, missing entire swaths of the country and how they felt, but also all over the world. And you guys just talked about that. The reduction in foreign correspondents, CE, and the number of correspondents, TS, around the world. And what that has led to is less esteem for the media. The Edelman creates a trust barometer. This measures trust in the US and around the world. In their poll in 2020, 18% of Trump voters trusted the media. Okay, maybe that's a given. Only 50%, only 57% of Biden voters trusted the media. That's pretty low. Across the world, 59% of people in 28 countries said journalists deliberately try to mislead the public by reporting information they know to be false. And the most trusted source of information in that poll across 28 countries was Google. Reuters Institute of Study of Journalism in London or in Oxford recently had their own poll, and they found that consumers were judging media not on the basis of any perceived competence or any perceived objectivity, but whether the media was delivering what they wanted to hear. So at the same time we have that, I would also argue the US is becoming less influential. Just like in the media, more competition around the world has challenged US influence. The US is no longer the lender of last resort, according to President Obama in 2007. The moment when Beijing realized that the US could not bail out the rest of the world is the moment it realized that it could expand or fast forward or accelerate its already growing capacity to try and achieve its outcomes by coercion and through disinformation. And of course, the impact, just like in journalism, of US mistakes, whether January 6th or others, is less esteem around the world. And so these two things are symbiotic. That happens as authoritarianism is on the rise. We don't have to talk about what China looks like for the dissident, what Russia looks like for the dissident, what other countries from the Philippines to Iran to Saudi Arabia looks like for the dissident. It is what Freedom House calls a worldwide effort to silence criticism, and the journalists are targeted as well. The 2021 World Press Freedom Index says journalism is blocked in 130 countries, and only 7% of countries are offered to consider a good environment for journalism. And so what is the impact on the US of all this, of the news media getting weaker as the US is challenged more and as authoritarianism is on the rise? Diplomats can't rely on the media to debunk disinformation. Thanks to the arguments of fake news, diplomats find it harder to push the idea of journalism, the idea of the free-flowing idea of information as democratic. Whether the introduction of the word fake news or something we can talk about later, the pretty close to destruction of the US AGM, the parent company overseeing VOA and other journalistic outlets designed by the United States to reach into countries not to deliver propaganda, but to deliver facts. These things make diplomats' arguments more difficult. And all of that means that there is a much more receptive audience around the world, that as US trust, as global trust decreases in the US government and in the media, Russian messages are easier to deliver and are received in a much more receptive way. And so that's the environment that has allowed for this crisis of misinformation. Let us call it what it is, and I didn't invent this term, geopolitical gaslighting. That's what we're looking at here. Long before 2016, Russia had been doing this in its adversaries, in its backyard, whether in the Baltics, in Ukraine, in Georgia. And of course, it came to the US in 2016. And remember, it was equal opportunity outrage. That's what they were looking to do, not only elect President Trump, but to get us pissed off at each other, whether it was over Black Lives Matter, Hillary, Obama, Trump, immigration. A stat that is extraordinary to think about how successful disinformation was, take out the politics. 150 million Americans were exposed to Russian disinformation in 2016. That is 7 times the number of Americans who watch the evening network news. I'm going to repeat that. 150 million Americans read Russian disinformation in 2016 before the election. 1/7 of that watches the evening news. And of course, success begets success. Iran, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Philippines, you name it. We've all seen the imitation of Russian tactics. We've also seen some of these tactics go to China. And this is absolutely essential as we examine our influence around the world. Some of the Chinese efforts in the last couple of years over COVID, for example, have been a little bit ham-fisted. There was a series of text messages that some of you might have received during COVID that were fake, that suggested that that President Trump was about to shut down the country. National Security Council staff had to release a statement. That was pretty easy to debunk. But a series of points of misinformation by Beijing has been much more difficult to debunk, in part because it's not aimed at the US. It is aimed at increasing Chinese influence around the world, and in so doing, reducing US influence. Chinese doctors are better qualified than those in the West. Chinese supplies in Europe, Southeast Asia, got there first before Western supplies could get there. The US was infighting while the Chinese government was helping local cities, and the death toll, even if the Chinese numbers are 1/10 of the reality, obviously the United States has largely failed compared to the Chinese government to defeat COVID. All of that, of course, shifts the blame away from China's failure to contain COVID in the first few weeks, and even regardless of whether it was a lab leak or a natural release. But like the Russians, what the Chinese goal is to portray China as the partner of first resort, to portray Western cohesion as weak and the United States as absent. This is about sowing division in the West, in NATO, in its allies, in order to enhance leverage, in order to allow China to focus on bilateral relationships where it can use economic pressure more effectively. Very difficult to combat. During COVID for Russia, same thing. European solidarity is a myth. EU assistance was inadequate. I'm leaving out some of the Russian examples that the vaccine will give you various diseases that we just heard repeated last week by President Bolsonaro in Brazil. And so into this environment, we have January 6th. And the question in front of us is, how impactful is the misinformation? Surely we can point out that the Chinese PPE was flawed. Surely we can point out through good journalism or diplomacy or statements by diplomats that in fact, no, we, the United States, have given more vaccine. We, the United States, have donated PPE with no strings attached, as the Biden administration says. Surely there's a way to do this. And we'll talk about what I think are the solutions in a second. But we've also seen the existential threat. Can liberal democracy become ungovernable because of this information? A person either wins an election or he or she does not, or so we thought. A vaccine is safe or it is not. Maybe not. Our very basic assumptions require a level of trust in the source, whether United States government or journalists. And as we've laid out, that trust has been eroded. And where there is no trust, there are no facts that we can agree on. People will choose perception over fact. They would prefer the media that gives them what they want over the media that provides them what they need. Enough people choose alternative facts, the Russians win. I remember talking to a Russian journalist named Michael Zigar, who used to run TV Rain, one of the few Russian television channels that actively opposed the Kremlin, or at least criticized the Kremlin when it deserved it, and exposed corruption. They've long since been shut down, their journalists persecuted. He described that Putin is not some all-knowing puppet master. By no means is he. And after the anecdote that I started with in 2014, when the Russians took Crimea, inside Russia, Moscow, the Kremlin, experimented on Russian TV through its cutouts on Russian television. And they experimented with the message that they think would work. And the first message was what I heard, right? The idea that we saved Ukraine from a pro-American fascist Nazi mob in Kyiv. And a few months after I left Crimea, the Kremlin realized actually that doesn't work so well. Second argument was the West is dying. You know, the West doesn't know what it's doing. Look, it's infighting. There's all these immigrants. You know, it's not working. And they found that wasn't as effective either. And then they hit on this thing about no facts. And obviously it's been around in Soviet history and Russian history before for forever. But this Kremlin in the last few years realized that this argument was the most effective. That is that they are corrupt, meaning the United States and the West. Their democracy is a sham. We may be corrupt too, and our democracy might be a sham too, but because they are corrupt and their democracy is a sham, it does not exist, the ability to have democracy. There are so many opinions there. Who could possibly know what a fact is? And when there are no facts, disinformation about the US, about Europe, can spread more easily. Russian media can find more eyeballs. And of course, we see how that has become domestic in the United States as well. And extraordinary thing, you don't always need to silence the dissident. In this case, you can drown him out. What the political scientists call censorship through noise. Okay, so journalists like to throw peanuts. We like to criticize. We like to challenge. We don't often suggest solutions. And so I will talk a little bit about what I believe is the antidote, knowing full well that it's perhaps, well, it is my place to talk about the antidote, but knowing full well that it's not generally what journalists do. And so you might not be surprised that I would argue that accuracy and transparency is the only antidote, because they are our greatest strengths. What does the world see in America, if not for the reason that America was born, that government can only function by the consent of the governed? Our willingness to confront our flaws actually challenges the authoritarian model, the authoritarian argument against us. And here too, the situation in my mind applies both to the media and diplomacy. Transparency and accuracy. The BBC is not respected. Let me rephrase that. The BBC is respected because it is not state-owned media. It is not seen as propaganda. Public diplomacy is respected when it is not a PR campaign. Public diplomacy cannot be a bandage after damage is done by policy. It has to be approached much like the solutions for the media. I read a few things by Joseph Nye on this, and he argues there's three parts of public diplomacy that you need to pursue. One is the daily communications, right? This is important, although limited. It challenges the vacuum. It prevents the vacuum from being filled. It can control what is said, but not what is heard. And so therefore, the second step is more strategic communication, the ideas, the slogans that represent the big ideas that can be disseminated over weeks and months and years. This can include debunking, fact-checking. This could also include discrediting, targeting the messenger and not just the message. But really, the solution is the lasting relationships that can exist in things like exchange programs, training. This creates the civil society. This creates the networks of contacts that can overcome some disinformation because you have a level of understanding. You can overcome differences in culture. You can overcome the knee-jerk reaction, and you can overcome some of the moment of Twitter, the hot takes, if you will, by creating relationships that turn into government to government relationships, civil society to civil society relationships, and of course, journalist to journalist relationship. It is the same antidote, I believe, or the same solution going forward for journalism. Of course, we have to focus on the daily, the simple act of tweeting, because we have no choice, the simple act of putting out quick stories in order to inform the audience. But the equivalent for journalism of strategic communication is the idea that we need to be better and give something to our audience that no one else is giving. We cannot rely on the idea that the New York Times is trusted in order to keep the New York Times to be trusted. We have to continue to prove, we have to continue to get better and prove to our audience, viewers, listeners, watchers, that they can see something on PBS NewsHour, read something in the Times, or listen to something on NPR, or read it in the Atlantic, or listen to a podcast that is not provided anywhere else. So many eyeballs are out there. There is such a competition. The solution is not to blame YouTube or blame TikTok, is simply to offer better content. And then lastly, the mirror of lasting relationships. Well, again, the same thing. The idea of creating in a younger generation interest in news, the belief that news can be informative and interesting and objective is something that is a generational battle for journalists, as it is the equivalent generational battle for diplomats today. And it is not something that we are winning, sadly, but it is something that we have to fight. And it is an existential threat. Let me end with an example of what I think kind of combines the idea of fighting for better journalism, fighting for better public diplomacy or diplomacy. And that is what I mentioned before, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and in this case, Radio Free Asia. As we all know, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, first one, before they were combined, one pointed at Europe, obviously, the other pointed at the Soviet Union, now combined. Their utility was in their impartiality. The belief was, when it was created half a century ago, that propaganda could not be defeated with propaganda. It promoted democratic values simply by being free, simply by existing, simply by delivering what we all believe is an essential part of democracy, which is the free flowing of information and the ability to expose even ourselves. fast forward to 2020. The outlet that exposed the largest detention in the world based on ethnicity since World War II was Radio Free Asia. Their Uyghur service was the first to report on what was happening to what we now know to be a network of labor camps, a network of detention camps that imprisoned more than 1 million Uyghurs. The Chinese call them re-education camps. The Uyghurs I spoke to describe scenes of beating, death, forced sterilization. But what exposed them was Radio Free Asia. Not because a political party in America wanted to target China, although it did happen at the time, but because we believed, the US believed, the West believed in the long-term benefit of an organization that was able to expose basic facts about a country whose government did not want those facts exposed. And those organizations still exist, despite attempts last year to destroy them. Radio Free Asia, Cuba, Middle East, all of these outlets, continue to inform people in these countries about the United States and, frankly, about their own countries. And so I leave with this thought that while a lie can spread much faster than truth, while opinion can be much more popular than basic news, it is incumbent on us to realize that we will rise and fall together, and that only in doing our jobs better, whether as journalists or as diplomats, and specifically on public diplomacy, can we try to have a long-term effort to overcome these existential threats that challenge us thanks to disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, Nick, that was a fascinating and reflective presentation, for which I thank you. We've got a little bit of time for questions. I wanted to start with a focus on the news media itself. Tyson Reeder, in his introductory speech, talked about how the news media of the 19th century was admittedly ideological, and it was not presumed to be a question that journalists had a perspective. And then as we've gotten into the 20th century and somewhat into the 21st century, we came to adopt this idea that you have just spoken so eloquently to, the need for objective journalism. At the same time, though, there seems, as I understand it, to be some discussion going on within newsrooms and among journalists as to whether, in fact, they have this obligation to be objective, and whether, in fact, they should not return to the ideological practices of the 19th century. And I would say, without any scientific basis, but as I look at the New York Times or the Washington Post, I certainly see an enormous amount of what I would have called editorial opinion bleeding over into news coverage. And so I wondered if you could comment on whether this perception is correct, and how vibrant this challenge is within journalism itself to maintaining the objectivity that I think you so correctly have said is essential to our long-term well-being.
The pressure to be opinionated, to be entertaining, which I would say in news, for better or worse goes, is one and the same, is a corporate pressure. It is not a grassroots pressure. It is not a perception among journalists of a certain age, certainly not older journalists, not journalists my age, and certainly not taught in journalism schools. It is a corporate pressure. It is a pressure built upon the success of the evening opinion programs on cable news, which make a lot of money because they have a lot of eyeballs, because they are entertaining and designed to persuade, not inform. And so I would not argue that the journalists themselves are questioning what you rightly point out is not a forever history by any means, but it is a history since the early 19th century of impartial, of objectivity. And so my challenge to my colleagues is that there is a way to be objective and yet also interesting and entertaining. A lot of people criticize Vice. I actually do the opposite. What Vice has shown is that there are young people who, by the millions, will watch hour-long documentaries about countries other than their own. And that is something that we should all remember. It is done in an interesting way. It's filmed beautifully often. It costs a lot of money, but don't mistake it for anything. It is news about the world, and much of it is objective and lapped up, and it has made a lot of money. So I believe that again, this is maybe naive, but if we were to do better, if we are okay with the fact that YouTube or TikTok are our competitors and realize that we need to engage through means that are unique and modern while maintaining our values. And I believe that argument can be made, but I admit that it's hard, and I admit that it's not cheap to do so. And unfortunately, the trends are going in the wrong direction there.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat about your view on foreign channels such as Al Jazeera or RT, Russia Today, Sputnik. Have you had to work with them, and how do they compare to the U.S. Voice of America?
So I used to work for Al Jazeera. I was the Middle East correspondent for Al Jazeera America. And so that's my experience with Al Jazeera. I think it's important to contrast, let's say, Sputnik and RT. So let's take those. Again, and I had a long, as part of our series in Russia, we had a long conversation with Margarita Simeon, who's the very well-connected and very well-known editor-in-chief of Russia Today. And she makes arguments that on their face are completely legitimate and completely reflective of a genuine Russian frustration with the West, and a genuine frustration, frankly, that you hear even from all over parts of America and the West, which is that, the media groupthink led to the Iraq War. Okay, that's a completely legitimate argument. There's a lot of scholars in America who would argue that. But her point in doing that, again, is saying that you can't trust anything that comes out of the Western media. Her goal is not to make the Western media better. It is to make the Western media less relevant. And in so doing, she makes her content relevant. And do not be, nobody here would be persuaded otherwise. RT is an arm of the Kremlin. It would not do anything or say anything the Kremlin disagreed with. And yet, again, speaking of tactics and new media, RT created a mechanism whereby millions and millions and millions and millions of people see their stuff on YouTube, even though very few people are watching them on television. I'm talking about their English language stuff. And so, again, the arguments are not dissimilar to what people here would say, but their goal is to be more influential by taking people like me or PBS NewsHour or the networks down a notch, just as the Russian government tries to do, take the United States down a notch through, sowing discord, through trying to create divisions between Europe and the US. And so that is mirrored. So that is the difference between VOA and RT, that while VOA is paid for by the government, the US government, by the way, RFERL and what they call the grantees are a little different, but you asked about VOA. VOA is paid for by the government. But again, its power is in the proof that it can point to on its mission statement that it is independent. And I think most journalists want that to remain that way as an antidote to the kinds of disinformation spread by Sputnik and RT.
Thank you. This is very helpful. There's another question that you spoke in your remarks about Chinese disinformation effort. How effective are they compared to the Russians? And how much does that play into US-Chinese relations?
So I think the Russians have been doing it a lot longer. There have been studies by the CIA of Russian active measures since 1948, 47. I mean, and frankly, even decades and centuries before, there's versions of Russian active measures before the Cold War, of course. So the Russians and the Soviets before them have done it a lot longer. They have baked it into their foreign policy for a lot longer, and they are willing to do it at the very top. Sergei Lavrov will go to Germany and make a point, this is a few years ago, about immigration, about how dangerous Syrian immigrants are, based on a single anecdote that was fake. That was faked by Russian television in order to make Merkel less popular. And so they'll do it from the bottom to the top. The Chinese, we have not seen quite that level of coordination, the grassroots coordination, all the way to top diplomats spouting disinformation. But if we're going to separate disinformation from propaganda, what the Chinese have done, especially in the last 14 or so years, 15 years, as the CCP became more confident in its expansion and its ability to communicate. And then by 2012, as Xi Jinping took over with the blessing of the CCP to be more aggressive, what we now call wolf warrior diplomacy started even before that with Young Jae-chul, who used to be in Washington, the original wolf warrior diplomat 10 years ago, went to a speech and said, we are the big country, you're the small country, you're going to listen to us. And so they didn't use disinformation, they used coercion and propaganda. And most effectively, not necessarily in the United States, right? That really has been a Russian victory. It's in their backyard, because the first Chinese goal is to diminish US influence in Asia, what we now call the Indo-Pacific. And so if that is the first Chinese goal, where is it targeted? Think about the important choke points all across Southeast Asia. So the Malacca Strait in Malaysia, 3/4 of all oil that goes into China goes through there. Malaysia has been a particular target of disinformation and political coercion campaigns. Go down south, farther southeast, US allies, Philippines, right? Target of Chinese gray zone tactics with Chinese Navy, as well as economic and political coercion. And of course, what we all know with Taiwan, and then ongoing antipathy with Japan, especially. So what we see a little bit less of is this kind of proud active measures. They've tried a little bit of that. It is much more about coercion and influence. And then in COVID, they added what the Russians try and do, a little bit of sowing discord between the United States and Europe. And they did that by trying to sell PPE through Europe and trumpeting that and trying to highlight some of the Trump administration's mistakes.
A new question in the chat. We have a few minutes left. Especially when reporting from abroad. If a US journalist reports egregious behavior by one side of the issue, do they feel an obligation to report an equivalent, quote unquote, behavior by the other side to simply be viewed as balanced?
I remember talking to Rose Gottermiller. I'll do a diplomacy example and then back to journalism. Rose Gottermiller was the Undersecretary of State for AVC, I think, no, Assistant Secretary of State for AVC, right? Arms Control. You guys remember what
Just
AVC?
published a book, and she just won the Academy's Book Award this year.
Exactly. So Rose told me this great story of when New Start diplomacy started. And you know, she was like, this is how the Russians do it, you know, the first time. She goes in and she says, okay, well, you guys are doing XYZ with this missile that we think goes against this deal. To which Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, leans back in his chair and says, well, you know what? You know what you did to the Vietnamese in the 1970s, and proceeds to try and filibuster for 30 or 40 minutes, right? We call it whataboutism. Interesting question, but what about what you do? Now, does Russian whataboutism work? Well, as long as you have a couple hours, you can put up with the first 30 minutes, right? As journalists, we don't have a couple hours. I feel under no obligation, for example, to claim that a Uyghur 14-year-old in Kashgar spray painted something nasty about Han Chinese. Now, do I feel it necessary to portray the Chinese perspective, or at least what they say is their perspective? Of course. And part of that is pointing out that there is a Uyghur terrorist group, a designated terrorist group based of Uyghurs that have operated out of Chechnya and Afghanistan that have claimed attacks. I mean, this is like verifiable claims of attacks in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square, in the West, Tiananmen, I think, where a woman killed 10 people with a knife. So I will point out that there are Uyghurs who have attacked, who are terrorists. I will allow the Chinese government to have a soundbite or have their say on that, but I will not withhold. And more to the point, I won't, like, if I have a 10-minute story, I'm not going to dedicate 5 minutes to that. I just want everyone to understand what the Chinese perspective is. But my story is about what's happening. And what is happening is, as I said, the largest detention based on ethnicity since World War II. And I'm going to show you that. And I'm hopefully going to deliver a level of understanding and empathy in order to do that. The more recent example that I'll quickly relate is Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian government is starving Tigrayans to death as we speak. Every time I say that through a story, there is a mention of the fact that Tigrayan soldiers have crossed borders into another part of Ethiopia called Amhara and killed quite a few people. So of course I mentioned that. And I mentioned that the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front used to lead Ethiopia. But the argument of the whataboutism that I get through hundreds or thousands of Ethiopian trolls every time I say this out loud is just that. It's whataboutism. I am not going to withhold my description of what the Ethiopian federal government is doing because somebody else says the TPLF are terrorists, nor will I fear the Ethiopian government's wrath for doing so. But I will bend over backwards to make sure that you hear from an Ethiopian and you hear the argument that that government makes. But it does not have to be the scales of justice. That's not my job.
Thank you. David Pierce has clearly been continuing to be with us because he's posed a question for you. And he would like to know what you would see the government official diplomats do better than what are they not doing now, especially in terms of infotech and training. What can government officials do better at communicating and suppliers of info?
Yeah, so I'll go back to that structure that I laid out at the end, which, you know, as I said, Joe Nye essentially lays out. But you know, it has to be all three, right? So the first, you know, was the daily communications, and so, you know, with all due respect to many of my State Department colleagues who've had to do this around the world, they would be the first to say that they're slow. Right, that they're slow on digital communications. They're slow because they don't have the resources or the assets. You know who does is the Department of Defense. And actually, if you watch their Twitter feeds, um, and slightly randomly, I'll give it, but even like when Tucker Carlson criticized the military or the Air Force for allowing women to become pilots, and for designing a flight suit that would allow for pregnant women. Tucker Carlson had a long screed about how the military is becoming soft. The U.S. military services all jumped onto Twitter and actually put something out. So anyway, that's a digression. Clearly, the State Department needs to be better funded, better trained, and better equipped to deliver communications relatively quickly. But that really is only part of it. The only goal there is to prevent too many vacuums. You can, again, as I said, you can control what's said, but you cannot control what is heard. And so the strategic communications is that one extra step that is more important. And that is the combination of policy and public diplomacy, the ideas of our strategy, what they are, put them into a nice little box and disseminate them over days, weeks, months, years. That can include some debunking and fact checking and a little bit of discrediting if you get there, if you want to go a little bit more offensive. And again, the lasting relationships, right? That even greater step. You know, I'm preaching to the choir, I know, in this crowd, but you know, soft diplomacy, you know, from Fulbright to U.S. libraries that every Pakistani who's 45 to 65 tell me that they used to love, that the U.S. canceled, as many of you will remember, to you know, cultural exchanges, to military exchanges. You know, this is the first generation of Pakistani chiefs of army that we have starting a couple of years ago with the current one that did not train in the United States. First time, right? Because, you know, for those of you who worked on Pakistan will know, the Pressler Amendment, they ended up going to Saudi Arabia rather than the US, and you have true divergences of perspective. Of course, we've always had that, but it doesn't help. And so, you know, that third level, you know, again, you know, who am I? I'm a journalist, but those kinds of interchanges are long-term the most essential, in my opinion.
I think that's hugely correct. It seems to be a battle that we are regularly losing with the Congress, particularly on the educational fellowships. I remember when I first served in Yemen, virtually no minister spoke English. When I came back to Yemen some years later, as a State Department officer, Deputy Assistant Secretary, every technocratic minister was speaking English, and they were the graduate of U.S. universities. Those were exchange programs that the U.S. government had funded and which we were now busily cutting off so that there would be no more. Now, of course, Yemen has descended into such chaos now that perhaps it doesn't matter. But there is, let's see, might have time for one more question. It says there are certain parts of the world covered more frequently and regularly, while others are almost not covered at all, despite important events happening there. E.g., protests in Colombia earlier this year, or back a year ago. The Nordost attack in Moscow was overshadowed by the DC sniper. Is that just a given, or is there anything journalists can do about this? Perhaps I should add, is that also simply a function of where American attention is?
On that last point, I am actually perhaps in the minority here. No, it is not about American interest or attention. It is about what editors think Americans are attentive to or care about. Let's call a spade here, right? There are editors who are making these decisions, but at its core, as I discussed at the top, this is a funding issue. So I will give you an example at ABC News where I used to work. There used to be two correspondents in Africa, one I think in Nairobi, one in Johannesburg. There used to be a whole Mexico City bureau. And there used to be, I'm just thinking about the Southern Hemisphere for a second, Not sure there was ever a Southeast Asia correspondent, but certainly a bureau in Delhi. Of course, not to even go into the number of bureaus that used to exist in Europe from Paris to Moscow. None of those, oh, and one in Tokyo, none of them exist, literally none. The only bureau outside the United States for ABC News Today is in London, and that also applies to all the networks. There are some individual employees, local and Western, in a few places around the world, but essentially everything is run out of London. And so when you look at the Southern Hemisphere, one, it's far from London, okay? Flying to Africa to do features, flying to South America to do features, or even to cover migration, which gets a little bit more coverage because of the political imperative of the border, is expensive, and it takes a long time. And US media simply don't have those funds anymore. But there are ways around this, again, and I've done very little touting of PBS NewsHour, but my boss, the foreign editor, Morgan Till, has created a network of freelancers around the world and works with, we've got to beg, borrow, and steal a little bit on public media here. And you will see a lot from parts of the world, or frankly, I'll do it myself, because guess what? We all help pay for the Associated Press and Reuters, and they are everywhere. And so we can use that and exploit that. Doesn't replace having people on the ground writing for years about a place, but at least it's a little bit of coverage. So what I would urge you all to do and think about is that, no, it is not a given that the United States media doesn't cover Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia. It is only a product of fewer resources and the subjectivities of editors. And so again, if the media did a better job, this is a chicken and egg argument, if the media did a better job of covering those parts of the world, there would be more interest. And I think it is incumbent on all of us to try and do that.
Well, Nick, I want to really thank you. This has been an absolutely fascinating and sometimes provocative discussion, but it's also been a discussion of real reflection and depth. And I appreciate the obvious thought that you have put into both your prepared remarks and your responses to the questions. I really thank you for being with us on this program.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to all of you for participating.